So I want to talk a little bit about why we see rebel groups and I guess also the state targeting civilians in conflict. And before I jump into three different explanations or stories about why we think this happens, and I want to say that this is probably one of the more challenging parts of the class for me personally to stand in front of folks or to talk through why rebels or why the state makes these kind of determinations. And a couple years ago, when the Syrian civil war was sort of ramping up, and the Assad regime was dropping barrel bombs and incendiary devices, white phosphorus, on schools, I remember hearing a story on NPR. A kid in one of these schools screaming out in English, to the reporter, where are you? Where's the UN? Aren't we human? Don't you hear us? And I just sat in my truck and I cried because I knew that I was going to have to go in and talk about this and explain why we as social scientists think we understand why violence gets turned against civilians. And I couldn't do it. And so I actually put this course on pause for a couple of years, not wanting to have to come back and do this particular lecture and have this particular conversation, because this conversation, more than any of the other conversations I've had in this course, is one where I have to kind of remind myself that there are real people experiencing real suffering on the other end of these conversations. And while we can talk about them from a theoretical perspective and try to understand why things happen, the reason we care is because there are real people on the other end of these decisions and of this violence. And if we can hopefully understand it better, we can figure out how to respond and mitigate and prevent this kind of violence from occurring. And so that's kind of how I've navigated through the challenge of social science around topics that are horrific, out and out horrific. So with that as my startup, I'm going to jump into a graphic and kind of talk through kind of what this says. Something that I think can help us to understand the tug of war that occurs in counterinsurgency versus insurgency, where both the state and the insurgent groups are trying to win over the support of the population, because the support of the population ends up being vital in terms of resources and in terms of information. Sometimes it's mentioned that they're talked about that the population is the fish in which the population is the sea in which the fish of insurgency swims. I've destroyed that quote, just ignore it. But the idea is that if you can convince people to be sympathizers and, maybe they're more inclined to pay their taxes, maybe they're more inclined to not cause problems for you, they're willing to actively support you, they're willing to give you cash, they're maybe willing to call in a tip about where the other side has forces, and then ideally you've got a subset of your active supporters that are willing to actually be combatants for you, whether that means joining a rebel group or whether that means becoming a counterinsurgent. And so we could think about it as a tug of war, but we could also think of it as like people can jump actively for strategic reasons. And so in Iraq, in 2006, 2007, when sort of the turning point against the Iraqi insurgency, the Arab awakening, or the Anbar awakening, I should say, led a bunch of Sunni groups that had been aligned with Al-Qaeda in Iraq to break with Al-Qaeda in Iraq and join with the Iraqi government. And they brought with them not just fighters that had been fighting against the Iraqi government. They brought with them all the knowledge about where the weapons caches were at and how the information networks moved and how money was being shipped around. And that kind of information, that jumping from militant on one end to counterinsurgent on the other, was incredibly valuable for the U.S. and for the Iraqi state, and able to kind of crush militant groups. So I'm putting this up here as sort of a starting point for thinking about the civilian population as something that insurgents care about, and that's going to lead us into our two major competing perspectives on why we see violence used against civilians. Jeremy Weinstein's Inside Rebellion is a really fantastic book, and it's one of the ones that I signed for this course because He talks about resource mobilization theory and kind of the implications of rebel group org behavior. Kalyvas's The Logic of Violence in Civil War is really focused primarily on this question of why do we see civilian targeting, and comes up with a very different story. And in fact, these stories kind of are antithetical to each other because they place the focus of that decision to use violence and in very different places, as we'll see. And so I'll just give a quick summary of Weinstein's argument, a quick summary of Kalyvas's argument, and then I'll pivot to a synthesis that Elizabeth Jean Wood has put forward in discussing why we see sexual violence used by groups against civilians. And so to kind of do a quick refresher on Weinstein, his central thesis is that the resource endowments that rebel groups have available to them shape in meaningful and significant ways how those groups evolve, and that has implications for whether or not groups use violence against civilians. And so rebel groups that have material resource endowments, they have a diamond mine that is available that they can loot, and therefore they have this massive influx of cash. They really don't need a large pool of supporters helping them out up here. That having a lot of sympathizers and active supporters isn't that all important, because all they really need is a diamond mine. And if that gives them enough cash, they don't even need people who are sympathetic to them, just people who are willing to show up for cash and participate in their organization for money. And then the job of the rebel group is just to make sure that the civilian population doesn't cause them problems. So a group that has this kind of material endowment is going to be less responsive to the civilian population, is maybe going to be interested in controlling the civilian population, and it's going to be bringing in people who maybe aren't motivated by the good that the group is trying to do, but are maybe motivated by their own private material gain. And those folks may be more inclined to brutalize the population. Likewise, or converse, I guess, would be groups that have not material endowments, but social endowments. Their support doesn't come from the diamond mine that they have. Their support comes from a population that is sympathetic to them, from the social networks that exist within the population. That's how the group is able to finance itself. And that's oftentimes slower. That's oftentimes harder to be able to build up and scale up. But the building that happens is more likely to be intentional in terms of maintaining good command and control over the people who come in, intentional in terms of bringing in people who are actually committed to the movement and who aren't going to do things that the movement doesn't want. And that slow building in a way that maintains connection to the community is going to produce rebel groups that are far less likely to victimize and attack and target the civilian population than you'll get with those groups that have a resource endowment. An additional dimension on this is that those resource groups, those materially endowed groups, diamond mines, are able to not just grow, but to grow very, very quickly. And that growing very quickly means that they suddenly have thousands of fighters and they haven't vetted any of them, and they haven't necessarily disciplined them or trained them or built them into coherent military units. They've just given them guns and said, here, go out and do stuff. And though the lack of command and control is what leads to violence against civilians. It's why these groups are brutalizing civilian populations rather than groups that are relying upon social endowments. And so Weinstein's story is one in which some groups grow in ways that lead to weak command and control, and that's what makes and bringing in people who are not motivated by the cause but are motivated by cash, and that's what leads to the brutalization of civilians. Whereas other groups grow in a way that requires them to be disciplined in the use of force and respectful of the civilian population. Kalyvas has a completely different story. His story is very much grounded in, not in sort of organizational behavior, the way Weinstein's is, but it's grounded in sort of rational calculations of rebel groups. And so in a sense, rebel groups are functioning as unitary rational actors. They're making strategic decisions about when and where to use violence. And this is one of the reasons why these two theories sort of sit in opposition, because Kalyvas's theory is one in which the decision to use violence is very intentional rather than a side effect of something else. And so Kalyvas notes that rebels and governments have to walk this fine line in navigating the local population. And in some situations, it makes sense to use violence indiscriminately. In some situations, it makes sense to use violence very selectively and carefully. And in some situations, you just kind of want to avoid violence against civilians as much as you possibly can. And so if you're thinking about territory that you control, from Kalyvas's perspective, you need to be able to target traitors, people who are against you, people who are working against you and collaborating with the state, or if you're the state collaborating with rebel groups, those people need to be arrested. Those people need to be punished in some way, and that needs to be visible so that the population sees that you are not allowing this kind of dissent to exist. On the other hand, if you're just sort of, targeting large swaths of the population with violence, that very quickly alienates the population that might have been sympathetic to you, or it might have at least tried to keep their head down and not get in your way, and that's going to make life very difficult for you. And so excessive violence is really problematic. But in the territory that you control, you have to make sure that you are effectively rooting out those who are working against you. And so Kalyvas thinks about this in terms of zones of control, that in your territory, you're using violence selectively. But in your adversary's territory, use violence as indiscriminately as you want, not just because it will, specifically because it serves a military purpose, which is that it communicates to people in territory held by your adversary that your adversary can't protect them, that your adversary is not able to actually govern that territory. And the contrast is that sort of areas that are contested, where you want the civilian population to support you, you want the civilian population to work with you, but you also need to sort of push out the state because they're also in that zone contesting away. And so in that sort of situation, you want to really avoid targeting civilians, because anything that you do that possibly turns the civilian population against you is going to be potentially bad. And so, again, from Kalyvas's perspective, this is being done intentionally, and it's not because some groups are good and some groups are bad. It's that groups are targeting civilians because it serves their interests to target civilians in this way. And this works for not just rebel groups, it also works for the state. And so if we're thinking about the Assad regime's just horrifically brutal counterinsurgency tactics of identifying cities that were held by rebels and just putting them under siege and starving the populations and shelling cities to the ground, or dropping barrel bombs on civilian populations in areas that were nominally supportive of or actively supportive of the rebel movement, Kalyvas's story fits that pretty well. Elizabeth Wood puts together, I think, a really good way of sort of joining these two theories. And she notes that there are differences in terms of groups, in terms of whether they have the organizational structure that allows for command and control to determine how violence is used. And those groups that have strong command and control may choose not to use violence. And she's interested specifically in sexual violence as a very particular kind of tactic that gets used intentionally at times. That strong command and control groups may make a decision to not use that form of violence, in which case they're punishing it when it happens, and the message goes out, you don't do this. Or they may make an intentional decision that says, yes, this is a tool that we're going to use to terrorize the civilian population, and it's being pushed out from the top to the civilian, or to the fighters and the combatants who carry it out as part of orders. But that's not the only pathway you can get. You can also get a pathway where the group's command and control structure is very weak. And in those situations, what Wood notes is that you get sexual violence when it becomes part of a group's repertoire of violence, of how the group operates and how it sort of socializes its members into the use of violence, that this is what we do, this is part of our group, and there may even be sort of a recreation of group norms, group identity, group culture through this form of violence. Where in other groups, the norms that emerge are ones that make sexual violence taboo. And if you do get individuals who are, engaging in sexual violence, they're not being punished from above. They're being punished by their compatriots on the front lines who are saying, no, knock that off. Like, this is unacceptable, and you will be punished, and we will ensure that you're punished, to maintain this group norm of how we conduct ourselves. And so while Weinstein and Kalyvas present these two competing stories about whether it's groups being intentional or groups not being able to control their frontline soldiers, Wood sort of takes those and says, well, it's actually both, but they're different stories, whether it's intentional orders coming from the top, or whether the group norms are making that permissible or not permissible. And you can't understand this kind of violence, and I would argue you can't understand any type of violence against civilians without kind of having both sides of that coin that Elizabeth Wood highlights.